Hi, everybody. Welcome to week 4, and this is chapter 4 of the Kettle text. This lecture, as you listen to it, you're going to note that it came from a different class I was teaching at a different university. So you're going to hear some references in this uh, lecture that might not apply, so just kind of ignore those. But the real thing I want to do with this lecture, it's a good lecture. It talks about the eras of public administration. This lecture will supplement but not substitute for the Kittle reading. So what I'd like you to do is use this in a way that helps you understand the Kittle reading in a little bit more detail, but don't take this lecture as a substitute for the Kittle chapter. So as long as we understand that, this is a supplement. Use this in conjunction with this week's reading and this week's discussion board. Thank you. So as I noted in on the intro slide, this what we're about this week is Kittle talks about some stuff that is interesting, and my problem with the Kittle text, frankly, is I think he assumes a little bit of knowledge that the reader might not have. So really, this lecture fills in some of those blanks when I talk about eras of public administration. And so the real question is, can we discern identifiable eras in public administration, and how do we do that? So what are these eras and what are they distinguished by? So again, use this as a supplement to Kittle, and hopefully when you put these two together, this lecture, which again I have taken from a different course that I taught a couple of years ago, and the Kittle text, I think this will illuminate, where we're at in public administration thinking as you move along.
This is what Stillman says in that reading I gave you for this week, that he identifies 5 distinct eras. Now, again, as I discussed with Rosenblum, the definition of these so-called eras of public administration are not hard and fast. Different authors are using different eras, of course. So, public administration, like all fields of academic endeavor, is very much in flux much of the time, and the thinkers in the field are constantly refining what we think about our own history, our own intellectual history, and where we think we're going. But Stillman comes up with these 4 eras. Personally, I would have broken the last era into a couple more movements, and you'll see as we go along through the course that we're going to talk about some of these later movements because they're important as we look at the last, say, 20 years of public administration thinking. There have been some major thought changes in the way we approach public administration, but nevertheless, these eras are really helpful as you think about where we've been and where we're going. So here's the 4 eras that Stillman comes up with: the Posdikorb orthodoxy, he calls it, the social science heterodoxy, the reassertion of democratic idealism, and the refounding movement. So let's talk about each of these in a little more detail. Okay, first of all, what is this thing called Posdikorb? Posdikorb is an acronym that really is credited to Luther Gulick in the 1930s. And it stands for planning, organizing, staffing, directing, coordinating, reporting, and budgeting. And really, this is a direct descendant of the politics-administrative dichotomy. Here's that term again, this term that we should constantly be thinking about and what it means. Even though people say there is no such thing, some people say, well, there really is such a thing, and we should think about it. Recall that Wilson, the reading we did, Woodrow Wilson, way back in 1887, and along with him, Goodnow, which I had you read, in 1900, Wilson called for a science of administration, and both Wilson and Goodnow had identified this dichotomy between what they called politics and what they called administration. And so Posdikorb grew out of that thinking, but it also grew out of the views on bureaucracy by Max Weber, the German sociologist, whose writings appeared in 1922, his most prominent writings, posthumously, as a matter of fact. Um, and then other authors have been quoting Weber ever since. But Weber wrote on bureaucracy, and then Frederick Taylor was the so-called father of something called scientific management. And I actually have you read some excerpts from both Weber and Taylor uh, coming up. And so what all these thinkers were talking about was really a normative theory of organization. So we all understand the difference between normative theory, which is we're saying this is how things should be, and empirical theory, which is what we observe. But the theories of Weber and Taylor were very much normative, and the theories of Wilson and Goodnow, for that matter, were very much normative, although they do mix their empirical observations in there. So Gulick really identified what he said was a science of administration along with Wilson, and he said that every organization in government mostly should be formulated in the form of a bureaucracy, which was what Weber was talking about. And every leader or executive of this kind of organization is engaged in these positive activities to a certain extent. And the higher up in the organization you went, the more you were absorbed by Positive. So what Gulick was really saying, and recall Gulick really was very much a contributor to the New Deal. He was very much involved in really the modernization of the office of the president, which occurred during the administration of Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And Gulick basically said if an effective administrator in a bureaucracy could do these Positive tasks right, then by by definition, the organization would be effective. And so this is the orthodoxy. Basically, this kind of orthodoxy drove, to a large extent, some of the reorganization in the office of the president that occurred during FDR's administration. And we'll see that later as I have you read an excerpt from something called the Brownlow Committee, which was a committee formed that really did actually bring about what we think of as the modern office of the presidency. So this was this era in the 1930s, say, to the 1940s. And we talked about some of this. These antecedents to Positive. So Frederick Taylor and scientific management. Taylor was very influential. He wrote on scientific management in 1912, and what was he saying? What Taylor was really saying was that every organization, and he was talking about government organizations, he was talking about factories, he was talking about maybe a railroad, any kind of organization or corporation. He said that basically what needed to be done in the modern industrial era was we needed to move away from this idea that craftsmen did their job based on rules of thumb and private knowledge that they held in their minds. He said it was possible to have a one best man for the job. That was his term, one best man for the job. And that the idea of the organization was to recruit this one best person for each job. And then he said the ideal ratio of management to workers was about 1:3. So basically, if you think of this as a bureaucracy, this pyramid bureaucracy, there's workers, and then there are first level supervisors, and then there are mid-level supervisors and executives. And the whole idea of the organization was to operate scientifically so that the most effective outputs would be developed. So it's very much opposed to kind of the old agricultural model that the United States had lived in, where, say, a farmer was effective because that farmer had the knowledge of, you know, soil conditions and local climatology in in their heads from a lifetime of experience. Taylor would probably support more corporate farming, where a large corporate farm was based more on what he would consider science. And so the other Posdakorb antecedent is Max Weber, another very influential person. Actually, Max Weber was far more influential after his death, but he wrote on in Germany, and then his work was widely translated. He wrote on the characteristics of bureaucracy. He believed that a, a bureaucracy was a very much rule-bound organization, and that the role of the official or the office, when he says office, he means the title or job, that these organizations were bound by certain rules that everyone followed. And so I have you read in a couple of weeks, I think, Weber and his views of bureaucracy. So both these things were very influential in the development of Posdakorb. And yeah, I forgot I had this slide in here. So these are the four main rules that Weber came up with. Again, bureaucracy is governed by a set of fixed and ordered rules, that there are regular activities distributed in a fixed way as official duties, that the authority to give commands is distributed in a stable way and is strictly delimited by the specific coercive means given to officials, and that only persons who have specified qualifications may serve in the bureaucracy. So the interesting thing about connecting Weber to Posdakorb and then Weber back to Wilson is this is kind of what Wilson had in mind. Wilson had in mind a administrative core, if you will. He believed that really what the should happen in U.S. government, and it did happen really to a great extent, is that there should be a professional core of administrators disconnected from the political process. In other words, disconnected from patronage or the spoils system, which had come about in the United States, and that this professional core was trained and educated and was operating given a set of fixed rules. And so think of really sort of a quintessential or stereotypical military organization, and this is what Weber had in mind for bureaucracy. So again, Gulick in 1937 said that this is a science. It's he says science, but I actually think it's more akin to a technical endeavor, say civil engineering, where how to pour concrete into a footing, and if properly applied, the building will be supported. So these are how Gulick defined these Posdakorb elements. He said planning was the broad outline of what needed to be done. Organizing is the establishment of formal structure. Staffing is the recruitment, training, and retention of the right people. Directing was continuous decision-making process. Coordinating was coordinating your organization as a leader with another organization to make sure that all the efforts were going the right way. Reporting, again, is just basically what it sounds like, up and down the chain of command. And budgeting is an inherent responsibility of this leader. So again, this orthodoxy did help shape much of the bureaucracy of the New Deal and World War II era. But then post-World War II, along comes some other thinkers, and I have you read some works. I actually have you read excerpts from the works of all these thinkers, Dahl, Simon, Waldo, who challenged the tenets of this Posdakorb orthodoxy. And so this era from 1947 to 1967 is called social science heterodoxy, just because the word heterodoxy means there's more than one way of looking at things. So Dahl, immediate post World War II, said that one of the problems with this politics administration dichotomy was that it's really not possible in his mind to create this sterile barrier between politics and administration, because administrators are involved to some extent in politics, and political people are involved in administration. So where the barrier is very permeable. That was one of the three problems he picked out. A second problem that Dahl had was that he said, this view of humans operating in bureaucracies was not necessarily factual. I mean, the Weberian view of a bureaucracy and the Gulickian view, if you will, depends very much on the idea that these people working in the bureaucracy are rational human beings who are making rational choices all the time, or what they would define as rational choices. But that's not necessarily the way people work, as we know. I mean, there are all kinds of reasons why people do the things they do, and that's no exception within a bureaucracy. And then he said, Dahl said that really there's this misunderstanding of cultural context. And what he really said in this article in 1947 was, we're assuming that this Pozdekor bureaucracy works well around the world, but we really have no reason to believe that. We really haven't studied anything but the United States. And so that was his criticism of the orthodoxy, that it might have worked worldwide, but he thought it was at least worth the look to see if it did work. Herbert Simon in 1947 was very damning of the orthodoxy. He wrote this article called Proverbs of Administration. Basically what he said was, a lot of what Gulick came up with is probably good ideas, but they weren't science. They were just aphorisms or proverbs. And he said, along with Dahl, that what we should be looking at in our bureaucracies, in our organizations, is how humans actually operate. What is our view of the individual? And he said that individuals are rational, but they're boundedly rational. That is, that they're able to make decisions in a bounded way, and they don't always have all the information they need. And so we have to accept that. And then finally, Waldo said that the real thing that we need to do in public administration is move beyond our narrow thinking, and we need to be more inclusive of all the sciences, social sciences and physical sciences, to understand the relationships that exist in public organizations, to understand how we fit into the larger scheme of things. We can't just assume that we can have a set of laws that apply within a bureaucracy and everything will work out okay. So he was calling for a broader scope of knowledge. And then following this era comes this idea of reassertion of democratic idealism. We spend 1 week in the course talking about new public administration. I'd kind of like to spend some more time talking about new public administration, but I purposely don't, because actually if some of you want to explore new public administration in your research papers, that'd be great. There's a lot of literature on new public administration, and some of the old professors who are now, a lot of them are passing away, as a matter of fact. Some of the old professors who are famous in public administration are people who were involved in what's called new public administration. And in the readings, I'm going to have you read some from Frederickson at the University of Kansas, and he was involved in new public administration at the beginning. But really what was happening in the 1960s, if let's take history in context. We had a very divisive war in the United States, the war in Vietnam. and a lot of people were questioning the structures, right? So um, public administration scholars were no different. There was a conference at Minnowbrook. Minnowbrook happens to be the conference center at Syracuse University, but really there was a movement by young professors, most of them under 35 years old, who said, public administration is not doing what it should. We are not doing what we should as public administrators, and they really wanted public administration to focus on ideas that were beyond this sort of neutral competency towards um, equity. So the normative values that had driven public administration up to that time really included efficiency, economy, and effectiveness, and now they wanted to add equity as a normative value. And in addition, they said, instead of uh, coming up with these stories of how well our politics administration dichotomy works, we need to have actual quantitative research techniques. We need to include things like behaviorism, and so they wanted to include better research techniques, and they also wanted to include what they considered to be more democracy. At the same time, beginning in the 70s, the work of Osterman Ostrom was key here, and that's an optional reading for later on, but Osterman Ostrom really helped launch in public administration the idea of public choice. And that was along with some other writers like Thibault um, and Nadowski. And I don't have you read a lot of those, but um, what they're talking about was the idea that government wasn't done just in these separate silo bureaucracies. As a matter of fact, some of these bureaucracies competed with each other, and so that we really have fragmented and overlapping authority. And it was really a rejection of this Weberian sense of each bureaucracy operating efficiently in its own little realm. And so we have this mix of ideas beginning in the late 1960s and really running all the way through the 80s. And so what are some of the legacies of this idea? So here's some that that Stillman pointed out. First of all, we have this clash of moral absolutes. We have this idea of new public administration versus public choice. We have a new set of normative values, as I mentioned. Instead of in public administration and government just talking about economy, efficiency, and effectiveness, we need to add equity. We need to add ethics, economics, and law. And very much during this time, there's this cry for relevancy. How do public administrators actually help people? And then there is this decline of the generalist public administration. And this really is carried over to today, where we have our academic career field is really split into a lot of specialties. And I think a lot of you who work for governments have seen this same thing operating, especially at the city government, for example. We have budget experts, we have planning experts, we have road experts, and so the generalist public administrator is rarer and rarer. Now we do have generalist public administrators. A great example of a generalist public administrator is a typical city administrator, especially for a city of, say, less than 10,000. So we have both. And then finally, is there an intellectual crisis in public administration, especially in the scholarly side? And that's one of the things Ostrom were talking about. Is there this intellectual crisis? Who are we? And finally, this widening gap between theory and practice. And that's probably an unfortunate one, and one that, in my personal view, we need to continue to work to overcome. And this is really why, our best link between theory and practice, in my mind, is the Master of Public Administration degree. And that's why I think it's important that we have a lot of MPAs in the practitioner workforce. And so then Stillman identifies this thing called the Refounding movement, and that thing came from a book called Refounding Public Administration that was published around 1990 by a lot of professors from Virginia Tech. Um, and really, what those senior scholars were trying to do is they had seen all this occur. Many of them had been involved in new public administration. Many of them had read the classic works and were experts on the classic works. And it was their sense that public administration needed to be literally refounded, and they needed to seek out the philosophical uh, foundations, if you will, of what public administration was all about. But during this refounding movement overall, we see a lot of things happening, and we're going to talk about some of these further in the course. The reinvention movement. What was happening in the 1990s when Osborne and Gabler wrote this book, Reinventing Government? Uh, that book was really advocated by Vice President Al Gore under President Bill Clinton, and they launched an initiative to reinvent federal governments. That was very popular. And then we have this idea of communitarians. We have, as I mentioned, the Virginia Tech refounding movement. And then we have this whole idea of an interpretivist turn, where this is still going on, where we challenge the values, assumptions, and language of what's going on in public administration. And so, okay, so now if you're thoroughly confused with the way I've been approaching this lecture so far, then I guess I understand. But how do we connect all these threads? Well, here's how I would connect these threads. I'd key on these three questions that Fry and Nigro asked in that reading I gave you. What is politics? What is administration? And where is administration situated? Right? So we're all public administrators. And we also know there's a such thing as politics. Now, the word politics gets kicked around a lot, right? I mean, the word politics gets used within many contexts. But what do we really mean by it? This is a great question to explore. Are politics the actions by which rulers rule? Are we talking about electoral politics? Are we talking about some kind of what we might think of as sleazy politics, where politicians are seeking personal advantage from the political process? Or is politics inherent in our institutions? Within city government, is politics inherent? Is politics inherent within agencies? Is politics inherent within departments? So what do we mean by politics? And the second question is, what is administration? I mean, can administrators also be partisans? The Hatch Act is one of the things that grew out of the idea that politics and administration should be separate. So the Hatch Act really forbade civil servants from being involved politically. When I was in the military, I couldn't, in my uniform, go and march in a protest, for example. I had to be separate from that. But it didn't mean I didn't have political views, but how free was I to express them? And the second question on what is administration is regulation and rulemaking, such as engaged in by the EPA and other agencies, is that inherently political? Some would claim it is. And then finally, where is administration, which we study, where is that situated? At the federal level, are all administrators part of the executive? So is the president really the chief executive of all administrators? And some would argue, actually, that that's not true, because there is constitutional ambiguity. That administrators have sort of a split loyalty. And I would encourage you to look at this book by Rohr, which that I include in the references, in 2002, where he talks about how public administrators and the Constitution are related. I don't assign that as a reading, but it'd be a great one to explore further.